It is a great honor to welcome Gil Troy onto this show. He is a presidential historian and a professor of university at McGill University. How are you today, Gil?
Doing great. Honored to be with you.
Thank you. And we are here to mainly discuss a book which you wrote in 2012, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary. It is titled The Moynihan Moment. But I should like to begin by asking you for a few thoughts on certain current issues, namely the elections in where you are, which is Israel. So, as far as I can tell, Benjamin Netanyahu won the election once again after a year out of power. So, I guess any more thoughts to contribute to that?
One of the things I think we have to emphasize is how deeply divided Israel is. So first of all, we saw that Israelis love democracy so much, they voted again and again and again and again and had 5 elections. So it shows the kind of the deadlock. But even in this election, which by the parliamentary mandates seems to be quite a clear victory for Netanyahu, and we have to say we had to play the election very, very cleverly. So he seems to be having 64 mandates in his coalition of two religious parties and one what's called a religious Zionist, more nationalist party. So that gives them 64. Of the 120, you need and you need 61 basically to have a majority in the Knesset and the Israeli parliament. But when you look closely at the numbers, the difference between the pro-Bibi camp and the anti-Bibi camp, and Bibi is the nickname of Netanyahu, is 4,000 votes. And if you look even closer, and you look at, for example, Tel Aviv, which is the high-tech capital of Israel, the cultural capital of Israel, the most left-leaning major center, the turnout was 60% there, whereas voter turnout throughout the entire country was 76%. So a few more votes in Tel Aviv, a higher percentage of voting in Tel Aviv, 4,000 more votes here and there would have changed the outcome. And all I say for that, and I think it's important also as you look to the American elections, is that we have a tendency to say, oh, the elections went this way, therefore the country is this or that. And we have to remember that elections are not sort of deep dive, multi-dimensional, three-dimensional pictures. They're not MRIs, right, of the human being. They're sometimes like X-rays, and sometimes they can be a little misleading. He or she who gets power, some represents the people to one extent, but sometimes not completely or accurately.
I see. Right. So, of course, having been out of power for 1 year, the political commentary obviously ponders the legacy of one Benjamin Bibi Netanyahu. But let's imagine that, say, Bibi is out of power for good, then he's enjoying retirement or is crafting a memoir about his own legacy. So how should we, I guess, gauge or assess the legacy of Mr. Netanyahu?
It's a very interesting question, partially because he actually just came out with a 650-page memoir, which he wrote while he was in opposition. He's very, very far from retiring. I think we should look in three different directions. One is economically. He, more than almost anybody else, was really central in helping Israel exit its more socialist collectivist approach and enter into a more capitalist startup nation approach. And I think historians will honor him and give him a lot of credit for that, which was certainly earlier on in his career. Second, I think when it comes to national security issues and diplomacy, he will probably get very high marks in the historical scorecard because he has, despite occasionally harsh rhetoric, has been extremely mature and sensible in running the defense industry, in the defense ministry when he was as prime minister. Parents who are of soldiers, be they from the left and the right, slept well knowing that Bibi Netanyahu was in charge. Where he is most controversial and where historians will be duking it out over his legacy for the next 10, 20, 30 years is on other issues, on social issues, on issues of honesty and integrity, on issues of did he improve the democracy or weaken the democracy, on issues of did he pull Israel too far to the right, too far into a nationalist camp, and not enough to a balanced liberal nationalist camp. Those are the issues where the election was actually fought out, and those are the issues where his legacy has been much more problematic for many people who want a more constructive liberal democratic Israel.
That's it. Right. So I guess we should bring our conversation closer to the main subject, which is the book, Moynihan's Moment. And I should like to do so by asking you a personal question, which is also a reference to one of your previous books. Why are you a Zionist?
Look, as someone who was born Jewish, as someone who was born into a family that understood what happens when Jews are powerless, as someone who was born into a family which celebrated the Jewish holidays, and people often ask me, even before they ask me, why I was Zionist, I say, why did you become a historian? And so many of our key holidays, like so many key American holidays, July 4th, Thanksgiving, are surrounded by history. And Jewish holidays are not only surrounded by history, but they're often surrounded by a certain sense of not just religion, but peoplehood, not just religion, but connection to the land, not just religion, but connection to our history. And so to me, to be a Zionist, which means to understand that Judaism is not just a religion, but Jews are also a people. To be a Zionist means that to understand that Judaism isn't just a religion that can take place anywhere, but so many of the rituals, so many of the ideas, so many of the big moments have taken place in the land of Israel. To be a Zionist means to understand that the Jewish people, while scattered in different corners of the world, always have had one center, one headquarters, one home, one capital, that is Jerusalem, that is Zion. Zion comes from the mountain in Jerusalem, Mount Zion. And when you talk about Zionism, you're talking about three different things. One, that the Jews are a people, not just a religion. Two, that the Jewish people, wherever they might live, wherever they might be born, have one homeland, the land of Israel. And three, that they have the rights to establish a state on that homeland. And those principles have guided me throughout my life, have given me a very strong sense of identity, and frankly, have given my children a strong sense of identity and a strong sense of purpose. And what are we looking for in life? In life, we're looking for a certain sense of mission, a certain sense of community, and a certain sense of purpose. And I've been lucky. Is it the only way? Of course not. Is it the best way? I'm not sure. But is it my way? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Right. And of course, going deeper into more personal territory, as a Jewish man, I wonder how would you comment on the latest outbursts of anti-Semitism? Of course, I'm referring to Kanye West, but I'm also referring to Donald Trump when he voices discontent about Jewish ingratitude over what he did to Israel. So with those two in mind, how would you assess the, state of anti-Semitism in the US and the world in general?
Well, first of all, I'll broaden that question, that very important question, by saying it's not only the bleeding of the tweets of Kanye West and others. It's not only the strange, I know what Jews should do and should think and should feel musings and rantings of Donald Trump, but we also see it in the universities, where Israel is so demonized that many Jewish students find themselves being bullied, where we most recently read that in Berkeley Law School, there are 9 student societies which wouldn't accept me to speak about American history because I dare to say that I'm a Zionist. Simply affiliating yourself with Israel and the Jewish people makes you, dare I say it, unkosher, unacceptable. So unfortunately, what we're seeing is in a world which is increasingly divided left and right, Jews are giving a big gift to the world. We found something which left-wingers and right-wingers can agree on, hating Jews. And I say it, sarcastically, but it's really very painful. I grew up in a world where I really believed that the world had learned the lesson of the Holocaust, had learned the lesson of Auschwitz, had learned the lesson of Hitler, which is hate breeds hate. And that hatred against Jews is not only problematic because of what it does to the Jew, it's also problematic because of what it does to your soul. And it's also problematic because what it does to the broader community. And we saw that Nazi Germany was the perfect example of how hatred overwhelms everyone. And hatred of the Jew cascades into hatred of gays and gypsies and dissidents and thinkers and teachers. And hatred also shrivels the soul. And before you know it, you have a country that's gone insane. I would have hoped that we would learn from that lesson, but instead I'm starting to see, and partially because of the Twitterverse, partially because of some of the trends that we're seeing on campus, partially some of the things we're seeing in American politics, is that American anti-Semitism isn't like European anti-Semitism. It's not like the anti-Semitism you sometimes see in parts of the Muslim world, but it's ugly and it's out there and it's getting worse. And more students I know feel oppressed, feel harassed, feel outed, feel bullied than they felt, Jewish students, than they did 5 years ago, 7 years ago, 10 years ago. And it's partially because of what they experience on campus, and it's partially because of what they experience in popular culture and in Twitter. And it's a problem. And we all need to fight together. We all need to work together fighting hatred, because I don't believe that you can say, oh, I'm going to fight hatred against African Americans or gays or women, but not against Jews. It has to be one integrated approach to fight discrimination, to fight bigotry, to fight racism in all its ugly manifestations and forms.
Mm-hmm. And one can say that the, I guess, exemption of the Jews, or at least the Zionists, when it comes to, advocating for marginalized or discriminated against groups, stems from, in part, from the UN and their anti-Zionist resolution. But of course, part of the Zionist FAQ is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and of course, I would pass along that question to you.
It is theoretically possible for me to say, you know what, I don't believe in nationalism, and I think that nationalism is very harmful, and so I don't think there should be Austrian nationalism, and there shouldn't be French nationalism, there shouldn't be American nationalism, and there shouldn't be Jewish nationalism. But first of all, it's really interesting that people always want the Jews to be first. There are 192 countries in the United Nations. I have one friend who says, we'll be 100th. Let's let 99 other countries experience and experiment with not being nationalist, then come to us. But why do we always have to be the first ones to denounce our nationalism? That's one dimension of the story. But the second dimension of the story is tonal. When I go on university campuses and I see that there's no anger against Russia, despite what it's doing in Ukraine today. There's no brutal anger. There's no instinctive, obsessive attack on Russia, against Syria for all the people they've killed in their civil war, against the Palestinians for being terrorists and for being homophobes and for being racists and for being sexists. And yet one small country, which happens to be a democracy, which happens also to be the only Jewish democracy in the world, and the only Jewish state in the world, Israel, is the one that's repeatedly singled out in, as you mentioned, the UN, in, as you mentioned, as I'm mentioning, universities. It just doesn't pass the smell test. And so most forms of anti-Zionism today are anti-Semitic, both because they are assailing the core Jewish decision to say my identity as a Jew and my identity as a Zionist are deeply intertwined, and you as outsiders don't have the right to define that. We as insiders have the right to define our own journey. And so anti-Zionism is problematic enough, but most forms of anti-Zionism today take on anti-Semitic forms in the language they use, the imagery they use, the traditional accusations they use, and the obsession they have with one small country. Israel, a very small country, has become the Jew of the world, in the way that in the Middle Ages, the Jews were the Israel of the world, the obsession, the scapegoat, the target, and that's unacceptable.
Yes, right. So let's talk about the United Nations a bit, because I'm talking to you now in Vienna, Austria, where one of the headquarters of the UN is placed. I grew up in Vietnam, which for the first 15 or 16 years of my life, the UN is portrayed as this great unification force in international conflicts. But of course, the more I learn about how the UN works and some of its failings, that is not so. I mean, it's a product of ideals, mostly raised by Americans. But over time, it has proven to be no more than the sum of the nations which have formed it, and particularly the Security Council, the 5 members, P5. There's a recent book by Walter Russell Mead called The Ark of the Covenant, which deals with the US-Israel relationship. And in it, he highlights the central irony of, despite despite the hostility between the UN and Israel at the moment, one must remember that the creation of Israel would not be possible had it not been for the UN resolution partitioning the Jewish land from the Arab lands of Palestine. So I guess as a historian, how would you trace the growing animosity between the Jewish state and the United Nations?
Before I approach it as a historian, let me approach it as you did, which is personally. I too, like you, grew up with great faith in the United Nations. I grew up in the post-war World War II world, which said that the best way to avoid World War III, the best way to avoid what Winston Churchill called war was jaw-jaw. The more we talk to one another, the more we create. And you're sitting in Vienna. I grew up in New York, and we were so proud of the fact that on the East River was that big new bluish greenish building, symbolizing hope, symbolizing possibility, symbolizing peace. Let me say one other thing. For all the criticisms I'm about to utter against the United Nations, I think we have to be very careful to criticize the United Nations General Assembly, criticize the United Nations Security Council, but understand, and this is actually one of the problems politically for Israel, internationally for Israel, the United Nations to this day is the greatest social service organization in world history. The United Nations to this day is the greatest force for good, fighting illiteracy, fighting disease, fighting famine, fighting poverty. And that's actually part of the problem, because when the United Nations passes anti-Israel resolutions, so we, in the American community, in the liberal democratic community, in the Jewish community, say, what's wrong with the United Nations? Many people in Africa, in Asia, hear the United Nations and say, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Why are you attacking the United Nations? We're seeing them fight disease. We're seeing them fight famine. So we have to understand that there are many dimensions of the United Nations. Having said that, you also accurately very well frame this as a historical question and a historical mystery. Today's November 8th. We're going to be in 21 days, November 29th, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration that the Jews have a right to a state in their homeland. And indeed, it's called the Partition Plan because there was a fight already between the Arabs and the Jews, and they divided the land. But even more than the division of the land, even more than calling it the Partition Plan, we call it the 29th of November because that was the day in Jewish history that said the world recognizes that we are a people, what I said earlier, that we have rights to a particular land, and we have rights to establish a state on that homeland, the people of Israel, the land of Israel, the state of Israel. And so Jews around the world at that moment, and we've seen the old newsreels of they sing and dance when the resolution is passed, go, wow, thank you, United Nations. And of course, in 1947, the Cold War is starting. And remarkably, the Soviet Union and the United States both vote for the resolution. Why? Because the Soviet Union is making a play. They say, well, so many of the early Zionists, so many of the ideological, intellectual architects of Palestine, which became Israel, but at the time was Palestine, Jewish Palestine, are Russian, are socialist, are creating things like the kibbutz, the communal farms. They're going to go with us. And so uniquely, some of my more religious friends would say miraculously, you have the Russians and the Americans agreeing in 1947 to establish the Jewish state. And then a year later, it's established. Unfortunately, as time goes on, as Israel emerges as a liberal democracy and allies with the United States in the Cold War, that's not the unfortunate part. The unfortunate part is that the Soviet Union then turns on Israel and starts boosting the Palestinian Arab attempt to destroy the state of Israel. Not to create a compromise, but to destroy the state of Israel. And that is the setup for 1975. And that is the setups for the change. So who changed? Not Israel, not the Jewish people. The United Nations changed. And as you pointed out, it became, in many ways, the developing nations dictators debating society, where the worst dictators, the communists, the thugs, took over the United Nations, seized it from the United States in the General Assembly, and even to a certain extent the Security Council, and used it to go after weak Israel. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the US ambassador to the United Nations, I'm sure we'll be getting to in 1975, understood that this was an attack on Israel, but the attack was on what he called democracy and decency, and it was an attack on the United States of America. How best to humiliate the United States of America if you don't have the votes against America? Go after its best friend, its ally, its ideological partner, Israel, little Israel, and scapegoat the Jewish people once again, as the Jewish people have been scapegoated for so many thousands of years.
Mhm. I should like to also mention, in regards to the United States' relationship with Israel, that a lot of people in Vietnam who, are not anti-Semitic at all, but the politically inclined ones, they believe in this notion of a Jewish lobby, which refers to a number of advocacy groups and individuals who advocates for the continuing partnership between U.S. and Israel, and as a byproduct of it, either downplay or whitewash Israel's effects on the Palestinians. And again, this is in part because as Vietnamese, we see America, in both parties, even though the Republicans and the Democrats are opposed to each other in so many ways, they all seem to agree on the question of Israel and America's continuing relationship with it. As in, you never hear the U.S. say anything bad about Israel and all that. And so there must be, a lobby front behind it. So I guess, of course, I regard that theory of the Israel lobby as wrong, but I wonder, how do you see the appeal of the Israel lobby theory on those who are, I guess, less well informed?
So let's take this from three dimensions. The first is just an interesting historical dimension, which is that when I was painting the picture of the shift from, one of the key elements was Vietnam, right? That the backlash in the United Nations, led by the Soviet Union against the United States' role in Vietnam, was one of the things that helped bring the Soviet Union together with the Palestinians in the developing world and the Arabs, and helped make many people want to try to punish the United States by picking on Israel. That's one dimension. We'll get to the Palestinians, that's the third dimension. But first, let's talk about this notion of, you framed it so eloquently, the Jewish lobby. And that's the tell. If you want to call it the pro-Israel lobby, like there's a pro-gun lobby, like there's a pro-Social Security lobby, like there's a pro-African-American lobby, then you're saying, look, there's a group of people who push, and indeed push, for a healthy relationship between the United States and Israel. As soon as you call it the Jewish lobby, and not you, obviously, as soon as critics call it the Jewish lobby, they're doing two things. One is they're echoing anti-Semitic dog whistles, anti-Semitic images about the powerful Jew, the manipulative Jew, the evil Jew. And underlying it is this notion that, and when you say, they say, well, Democrats and Republicans agree, there must be some kind of lobby. There must be some kind of nefarious Jewish force pushing behind it. Occam's razor says, go with the simplest explanation. Maybe the simplest explanation is Republicans and Democrats agree because supporting Israel is the right thing to do. It's the logical thing to do. The Jewish lobby critique hinges on the notion that America is going against its best interests by supporting Israel.
Yes.
And in fact, what we see, and you see it in Russell Mead's book, and you see Walter Russell Mead's book, and you see it in many other books, and you see it in my own writings, is that relationship is built on what people like to call it two pillars. I call it three pillars, because a three-legged stool is much stronger. People like to emphasize that the United States and Israel, especially since the Cold War, but continuing after the Cold War, have shared interests and have shared values. And I like to add the third stool of shared challenges. Shared interests, because we're on the side of the democracies, we're on the side of the West, we're on the side against dictatorship and thugs and terrorism in the world today. Shared values, because we are the small group of liberal democracies and an even smaller group of ideological liberal democracies. who are based on ideas, based on ideals, based on a liberal nationalist view. And the third dimension, when I say shared challenges, is in this complicated world where democracy itself sometimes is under attack. Americans and Israelis have different formulas. We see it in the elections going on in Israel and the elections going on in the United States, and they can potentially learn from one another. So this whole Jewish lobby thing is saying, oh, the United States is somehow held hostage by these evil, powerful forces who were like marionettes manipulating the puppet. And I say, no. What we actually see is the healthy relationship between the United States and Israel, like the healthy relationship between the United States and England, is about intelligent people in intelligent countries understanding what's best for them and for their people. Now, let's get to the third dimension, which is the Palestinians.
Mhm.
There is a Palestinian problem out there. There is a problem for Israel of two things. One is, how do you maintain your own security? How to defend your own people, which every country is most responsible for defending themselves. How do we defend ourselves against people who have repeatedly called not just for their own state, but for our annihilation, who celebrate when our children, when our elderly, when our young people are killed, who blow up buses and blow up cafes and don't just target soldiers, but target civilians. Our first responsibility as any state, as a Jewish state, as a democratic Jewish state, is to defend our people. But at the same time, there is a problem, which is, how do you control a population that is cheek by jowl with you, that doesn't want you? Now, the mistake that people make on purpose is they clump all the Palestinians together. Israel in 2005 withdrew from Gaza in order to try to minimize the number of Palestinians under their control. Israel, even earlier in the 1990s, withdrew from many of the central cities of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria, in order to minimize the Israeli footprint and create something called the Palestinian Authority that was called the Oslo Accords. And today, 20% of Israel proper is Israeli Arabs, who could also be called Palestinians, who are full, equal voting members of the Israeli polity. Every single Israeli Arab citizen was allowed to vote, just like every single Israeli Jew was allowed to vote last week. So it's more complex. Does it sometimes feel very easy for the Palestinians to demonize Israel and say, oh, you see, they're all just oppressing us? Yes, but that us is complex. And the reason why Israel does what it does is also complex. And I think many Americans understand that, and many critics choose not to.
Right. I wish to stick to the question of the Arab citizens living in Israel for a moment, because of course, since we begin with the election in Israel, of course, a name that comes up all the time, at least in my news diet, is a man named Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is, by all accounts, deeply anti-Arab. And Israeli Arabs can also point out to the basic law, which states that Israel is a state for the Jewish people, or the Jewish state, depending on the legal phrasing. And in that sense, they always feel like they are guests in the Jewish state of Israel. And what's more is that demographically, in order for Israel to maintain being a Jewish state, the Arabs will forever be a minority in the land of Israel. And so, it's not like I don't subscribe to the Israel is an apartheid state rhetoric that the far left is espousing, but we have to acknowledge that the Arabs in Israel have the perception that this government, even though they vote in it, is not working in their interest. So how would you answer that?
First, let's frame it by pointing out that there are 21 Arab states which are majority Arab states. And I've never, ever, ever heard a complaint that says, oh my goodness, it's so unfair that those states have majority Arabs. And yes, there's this one state called the Jewish state, the only Jewish state in existence, where not by law, but just by fact, by population, by demography, so far 20% are Arabs and 80% are Jews. And yes, most Jews want to keep a Jewish majority there, just like most French people want to keep a French majority in France. And I don't think that's necessarily bigoted as long as you make sure that every single one of your citizens has equal rights, voting rights, the right to free speech. And I'm a critic of the Basic Law because I felt that while it said a lot of things which are very obvious, and it did protect the rights of Arabs in many ways, it missed over something that was already in the Declaration of Independence. And some people say, well, it's already in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, which is one of the foundational documents of Israel, and the Basic Law only extends and doesn't upstage, says very, very clearly that we offer equality to all our inhabitants. And when they wrote that in 1948, they knew that all our inhabitants meant our Christian and Muslim, mostly Arab brothers and sisters. And the Basic Law doesn't deny that. So would have I preferred for the Basic Law to affirm, to further affirm, to reaffirm, to underscore? Absolutely. But it didn't take away the basic equality that was promised in 1948 and has been both legislated and guaranteed by the Supreme Court again and again and again. That's number one. Number two, let's take 4 snapshots. I always say when I travel around to universities, I say, if a student says to me, hallelujah, I see the light, I'm in trouble. Because the next speaker is going to come, he's going to be funnier, she's going to be smarter, they're going to be more engaging, and then you'll say, hallelujah, I see that light. I say, let's see the grays. Okay? So let's take 4 moments in recent history. Let's, and go backwards in time. Let's take last week when Itamar Ben-Gvir was elected. And I should say that I wrote a series of columns before, and I've written so far 2 columns afterwards, condemning his rhetoric. I call him a goonatic, which is a goonish lunatic. And I sometimes call him a Junitic, because he's a Jewish. I say in America, we have red, white, and blunatics, and in Israel, we have some Junitics. And so I've been an outspoken critic of Itamar Ben-Gvir. So let's take that moment when Itamar Ben-Gvir was elected. Let's go back in time, a year and a half ago, and we should be subtle and say he was already elected Knesset before. This is his party with other parties won 14 seats in the 120-person Knesset, so it got a little more than 10% of the vote. Let's go back a year and a half ago, when you mentioned at the beginning that Bibi Netanyahu was in opposition, and a new coalition came, led by Naftali Bennett, who's also somebody from the right, and it had Arabs in the coalition.
Yes.
Let's go back earlier than that, a year before that, to May 2021, when there was a series of riots in shared cities and mixed cities of Lod and Akko, triggered by Israeli Arabs attacking Israeli Jews. And let's go back a year before that to May 2020, when at the height of COVID, when we were in our lockdowns, there were all these images showing Arab nurses and Jewish nurses working together, Arab doctors and Jewish doctors working together. A very famous picture that went around the internet of an Arab ambulance driver and a Jewish ambulance driver stopping. The Jewish ambulance driver turns toward Jerusalem for his prayer. The Muslim Arab driver goes on his knees and turns toward Mecca for his prayer. I've given you 4 snapshots in the last 3 years. Which one defines Israel? Half the people want to say, oh, the beautiful Israel, it's perfect. Half of them want to say, oh, the evil Israel, it's negative. I say both. Israel's complicated. All countries are complicated. And I want to build up the story of cooperation, to build up the story of mutual respect, to build up the story of the 20% of the 20% of Israeli doctors who are Arab, the 23% of Israeli nurses who are Arab, the 43% of Israeli pharmacists who are Arab, who show that there really is a middle class, an Israeli Arab middle class that's growing. And I want to knock down and refute and fight against the haters be they Arab thugs coming to beat up Jewish neighbors in May 2021, or some of these goonatics who've recently been elected to the Knesset. Yes. In short, it's grays. It's not black and white. It's not blue and white.
I understand. Now let's turn to Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of my favorite U.S. politicians among thinkers and thinkers among politicians. So the reason for his appointment to the position of U.S. representative in the UN or ambassador was due to an article that he wrote for Commentary magazine, which a magnificent one. I mean, even Norman Podhoretz, who was the editor of the magazine, held a press conference to launch the article. It is titled "The United States in Opposition." I've always found it funny that that article got him to be selected as UN ambassador by none other than Henry Kissinger, very consequential and controversial figure in Vietnam as well. So the irony is that Kissinger, being a Jewish man, is not as pro-Israel as Moynihan, who is a non-Jewish man. So I guess what can you tell about the thesis of the article, "The United States in Opposition"?
So before I get to that, let's do some show and tell. This is the book Moynihan's Moment.
Yes.
And here you see Moynihan's power. I also have right here, next to my desk, a picture. I hope it shows up well on the online. It's a picture of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Henry Kissinger, and Kurt Waldheim. And this is a picture that was given to me by Daniel Patrick Moynihan's daughter Maura, as a thank you for writing the book. I'll get to your question in a second, if you will, but it's a great story because it turned out that Kurt Waldheim, who was the Secretary General of the UN, had a Nazi past, and a joke was made, which is, if Alzheimer's disease means that you forget who you are, Waldheim's disease means that you forget you were a Nazi. And Moynihan had already heard these rumors, and Moynihan, if you look at the picture, I don't know again if it comes out well, Henry Kissinger is in charm mode. He's so thrilled. He's this Holocaust refugee, this academic who's made it to sit next to the Secretary General. Everything in Moynihan's body language is showing, I don't want to be near this man. Kissinger's like this. And that tells the story of Moynihan and Kissinger. So indeed, and this picks up the storyline with Vietnam. The Vietnam War takes place. America's standing in the world is battered and brutalized as the war turns, as accusations of criminality and of bombing, which of course connect also to Henry Kissinger, mount. Moynihan is at the time ambassador to India. And sitting in India, which is in many ways the capital of what they called at the time the Third World, seeing how the UN is now no longer becoming the platform for the United States and England and France to advance democracy, but is increasingly, as you said at the beginning, becoming the platform to bash America. And watching all these countries get money, foreign aid from the United States, and still vote against the United States, Moynihan's going, what the heck's going on here? We're supporting all these countries, and they're thanking us by beating us up. Now, I could just blame the countries, he's saying, but I want to, as a thinker, blame our strategy. We are so used to running the UN. We are so used to the Pax Americana, the American peace that we ran since World War II, that we're not noticing that the world has changed. And so he writes this article saying the US is now in opposition. The US in opposition is saying we need a different skill set. Diplomacy isn't just about being nice and going to cocktail parties and saying whatever anybody says is correct. Diplomacy also sometimes is saying, no, here's a red line. You want my foreign aid? Vote for me. You want my friendship? Be nice to me. And so he writes this article saying, A, the world has changed. B, our strategy has to change with the changing of the world. Henry Kissinger is in his limousine. He's Secretary of State. He's reading this. And he says what academics rarely say, the highest compliment an academic can give. Wow, I wish I had written this. I wish I was that smart. And Kissinger has an ego by himself and is not one to allow something like that. And so to say something like that. And so Kissinger goes to Gerald Ford, who was the president at the time. And before you know it, Daniel Patrick Moynihan is appointed ambassador to the United Nations.
Well, so my next question would be, I guess that was the beginning of what would we call Moynihan's moment. But I would like to say, many of my fellow Vietnamese who would find that thesis of his and say, well, why is the United States in opposition? Because, well, one, you have a seat in the Security Council. You were the founding members. You were one of the founding members. The UN headquarters is based in New York. Compared to, you should see how our country, Vietnam, is doing. We are the smaller countries. You are the one dictating on the policies of the UN. Your money is what makes the UN work. So I guess, how would you address that?
In the 1950s and 1960s, the United Nations kind of ruled the roost in the United Nations. And things started changing, partially because of the Vietnam War, partially because of the rise of other developing countries, partially because of the Soviet manipulation. And what Moynihan is saying is, how could, with all the money that the United States pumps into the United Nations, how could the United Nations now be voting consistently against the United States and against democratic ideals? How could dictatorships, which deprive their own people of democratic rights, use their democratic rights in the UN to advance the agenda of dictatorships and to pick on small countries like democratic Israel? And so Moynihan is saying, wait a minute, things are getting really upside down here. He arrives in early 1975. By November 1975, he's fighting a resolution, which at the time there are 142 countries in the United Nations. Today there are 193. In this forum of nationalisms, they single out one country, one form of nationalism, Israel, with its form of nationalism, Zionism, and say that that country is nationalist and that country is racist. And so they say Zionism is racism. And Moynihan goes, wait a minute, what are you talking about? Zionism is Jewish nationalism. Jews are actually dark-skinned and light-skinned. Jews come from many different countries because they were scattered. You can convert into Judaism, the religion, you automatically become a member of the Jewish people, right? I was born in America. Nobody can convert into being born in America. They can potentially get American citizenship, right? But you're only born in America if you're born in America. In Israel, in the Jewish world, if you convert into Judaism, you're a Jew. So in fact, biologically, Jewish nationalism is the least race-based, the least blood-based, the most permeable. And it is the one form of nationalism, in this form of nationalism being called racism. Well, obviously, he says, this isn't because of anything inherent in Zionism, inherent in Judaism. It's because they're trying to pick on Israel, because they're trying to pick on the Jews, because they're singling out the Jews. And he says, as a tough kid from the streets of New York, when I see a bully and I see a friend of mine being bullied, I stand up. So is there a critique that certain countries could have about the United States at different points throwing their weight around? Yes, but in the 1970s, America's in trouble. I've actually always wanted somebody to write a movie about Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And you know how every good movie has a tagline? Yeah. I want the tagline to be, when America was down, one man stood up, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And I think that's really, I think it's actually, it could be like a great Netflix series like The Crown, because he served in so many different administrations. He worked with liberals and Democrats and Republicans and conservatives. He was, as you said at the beginning, and we sort of skipped over this, but we should emphasize, such a thoughtful, professorial scholar. You know, at one point when he was senator, this is after his UN time, people started complaining that he drank too much. And his friend George Will said, I don't know about whether Daniel Patrick Moynihan drinks too much. All I know is that he writes too much. And that Daniel Patrick Moynihan has written more books than most senators have read.
Yes.
And if we go back to the great tradition of scholar statesmen like Thomas Jefferson, like John F. Kennedy, Daniel Patrick Moynihan was as smart, as clever, as scholarly, and as statesmanlike as they were at their best.
Well, yeah. So to quote the rousing speech he gave to the UN, the United States does not acknowledge, abide by, or acquiesce in this infamous act. I got to listen to the entirety of the speech, which will celebrate its, I believe, 47th anniversary this upcoming November 10th.
Right.
And it is truly, the his theory of the United States in opposition being put to practice. And of course, I would be curious if there will be a Pat Moynihan biopic, who would you pick as the lead actor, sorry, to play or actress to play the senator? And secondly, I would also like to focus on the conflict between Moynihan and Kissinger, because I think that speech, along with some of the other things Moynihan did as ambassador, got him, dismissed from the role after 6 months. And I think the conflict with Kissinger was a main component to that. So, of course, the question of which actor to play Moynihan, and secondly, the conflict between Moynihan and Kissinger.
So before we get to the actor, let's get to the setting. Okay.
Mhm.
It's November 10th, 1975.
Mhm.
As you point out with your excellent math skills, 47 years ago. The United States is on the way down. It feels humiliated. Watergate, inflation, the loss of Vietnam, the humiliation of all the attacks on the United States, which just 30 years earlier had been the superhero that won World War II and beat the Nazis. In New York itself, where the United Nations General Assembly is meeting, there's crime, there's grime, there's chaos, there's inflation, there's looming bankruptcy. And in the United Nations, there's a pile-on against Israel and a pile-on against the United States that the Soviet Union and the Palestinians and the Arab countries are manipulating. So when Daniel Patrick Moynihan gets up to rise and declare that the United States will not abide by, will not acknowledge, will never acquiesce in this infamous act, and he uses the phrase infamous act, which is an echo of Franklin Roosevelt's speech in 1941 against the bombing of Pearl Harbor. He is rallying the troops. And by the way, after that, when Daniel Patrick Moynihan walks down the streets of New York, cabbies honk him and go, "You go at it, boy! You show him, Pat!" And many other things, which we won't quote because the New Yorkers sometimes quickly go into cuss words to show how much they love him. He walks into Carnegie Hall, and as one, people recognize him and stand up and give him a rousing standing ovation. Why? Because when America was down, one man stood up. So who would I want to play Daniel Patrick Moynihan? I'd want like a thoughtful, intelligent actor, like someone like James Wood. Maybe if we go back to The West Wing and you see how quickly Rob Lowe in his character as Sam in West Wing was able to put in so many words at once. He has something about that. You might want to have somebody who had a little bit more of an Irish cast to him, but you'd want somebody who's tall, who's commanding, and also incredibly quick with his tongue. Once upon a time, I would have said Kevin Spacey, but he's no longer so politically correct because of his reprehensible behavior. I shouldn't make light of it. But all I'm talking about is kind of his the smartness that he brought to an acting role. In terms of Moynihan Kissinger, it really is a clash of egos. So if the Moynihan biopic could be a great Netflix series or a great movie, the Kissinger Moynihan clash could make a great Broadway play. Two egos, two Harvard professors, two super intellectuals used to being the smartest guy in the room, and now they're in the room together, so one of them has to be the second smartest guy in the room. And Kissinger plays all these games with Moynihan. He, on the one hand, builds him up. On the other hand, he knocks him down. On the one hand, he sees that Moynihan understands the need to push back, and he wants to be Mr. Détente, so he doesn't mind a little bit of good cop, bad cop. But on the other hand, as you point out, that very speech that he gives on November 10th helps get him fired. And here you have strange psychology. Henry Kissinger is this German Jewish refugee from the Nazi era who lost 14 relatives in the Holocaust, who is speaking to his more white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, we call WASPy, advisors in the State Department about Moynihan's speech on the afternoon of November 10th, 1975, and he says, why is Moynihan acting like this? That we're doing foreign policy here. This isn't a synagogue. Imagine how crazy it is. So here you have the Jewish guy making fun of the Irish Catholic guy that this isn't a synagogue, saying that Moynihan is playing to Israel too much and playing to the New Yorkers too much. And he wasn't playing to Israel. He wasn't playing to New Yorkers. He was playing to Americans, and he was playing to the bar of history, and he was playing to the fight for democracy and decency. And Henry Kissinger, who at other moments in his career was very far-seeing and was right, in this moment, as at other moments, was wrong, was dismissive of Moynihan, and it became very clear that the two egos, especially after Moynihan became such a pop star, he was on the cover of Time magazine. He was one of 25, he was one of People's 25 most intriguing people. It was impossible for Kissinger and Moynihan to continue, and indeed, they Kissinger soon maneuvered for Moynihan to resign under pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one should remember that in the years before, Kissinger was the pop star of American foreign policy and American government. And you see John Belushi imitating him on Saturday Night Live, and he was going around schmoozing with models and superstars and all that.
Right, he was dating them. He was a star. Yeah, he was a celebrity, and he still was. But it was Moynihan was stealing from that, and it wasn't good for the ego.
Right. So, nevertheless, Moynihan's rousing speech aside, the Zionism as racism movement, which has been known now, was upheld, was voted by a majority. Again, Vietnam as a country was not admitted as a member of the United Nations, so we have no responsibility in that, unfortunately. But it was only, I guess, abolished in 1990, I believe, or at least somewhere in the 90s. So in that sense, the Soviets and its Arab allies won, but nevertheless, Moynihan's moment triggered this push-pull of American foreign policy, in that should we be more friendly to the UN or should we be more oppositional to the UN? You can see that in Bush's skirting of UN law in order to launch the conflict in Iraq, and then Obama being a bit more appeasing to the UN, and later on making that nuclear deal, P5+1. So I guess as a historian and as a political commentator, what is the ideal balance of, I guess, the US-UN relationship?
Well, again, the reason why I called the book Moynihan's Moment is because it was a moment where Moynihan stood up, and where the American people stood up for virtue and for democracy. But it also was a moment when many Americans lost faith in the UN. And again, as I point out, it's important to remember that that it's one piece of the UN. There are other parts of the UN that are very, very honorable and very, very constructive. And in many ways, since that moment, since the 1970s, the United States, certainly if we look at public opinion polls, and the United States in general, has never returned to those idealistic days of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it really was a turning point. There have been, as you point out, ups and downs. It partially depends on the president. Some presidents rely more and trust more on the United Nations and international diplomacy. Sometimes it depends on dynamics in the United Nations. So within the United States, there's definitely a push and pull, as you point out, and up and down. Within the United Nations and Israel, indeed, as you mentioned, as the Soviet Union collapsed, they rescinded the resolution, and it was a tremendous victory. It was, first of all, a bipartisan victory where Moynihan, who was a liberal Democrat, worked closely with Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush, the elder, to create a Republican-Democratic coalition and an international coalition to undo this ugly Cold War slur on Israel and the Jewish people. So that's a great victory. And yet, as Moynihan pointed out, and as the ambassador to the UN from Israel at the time, Chaim Herzog, the father of the current president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, pointed out, it nevertheless injected into the international bloodstream this poison. And the poison has never gone away. So even when the resolution was repealed, there were two other resolutions that day which were not focused on that created a bureaucracy to constantly be going after Israel, constantly going after Zionism, constantly put Israel in the docket. And even this past year, with all the awful things that the Soviet Union did, with all the awful things that China has done, with all the awful things that Iranian mullahs have done to their own people, there have been more resolutions passed against Israel than against all those countries combined. And so despite the repeal, the pile-on against Israel and the demonization of Israel and the Jewish people and of Zionism, unfortunately, has continued. And it's hurt the United Nations credibility, and it's hurt its popularity, certainly in the United States, and I wish more broadly in the world.
Mhm. Right. So final question. I've always liked to mention this story to Jewish people and Israelis whenever I meet them. And that being a historian, you should probably know this. Menachem Begin, among the many great things that he did, was he admitted and integrated a group of Vietnamese refugees known as the boat people into the land of Israel. And that is why you see probably 100 or 200 Vietnamese living in Israel, some converted as Jews. And so in Vietnam, much of our knowledge of Israel comes from that best-selling book, Startup Nation by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. But we still have that misconception about the Israel lobby and Jewish lobby because there is not much of a Jewish community in Vietnam, and most of Vietnamese people have not met a Jewish person in their lives. So with that said, my question now to you is, what can, say, Vietnamese people, I guess, or any other people in any other country where, say, Jewish people and Jewish culture are not common, learn from Israel and the Zionist triumph?
So first of all, I just want to comment on the boat people. It's an extraordinary story because Menachem Begin was newly elected. It's 1977. There are these refugees literally on boats, literally on rickety ships, and they're fleeing the worst kind of persecution, and no country wants to take them in. And Menachem Begin, who lost relatives in the Holocaust, who ran away from the Holocaust and helped create a Jewish state, said, we're going to take you in. And people go, what? Little Israel, little pathetic, weak, poor Israel is doing this? And he said, yes, because you may look at us as weak, poor, and pathetic, but we are part of a proud people. We punch way above our weight, and this is the right thing to do. And I remember how proud we were of Begin for doing that. And it still remains one of the great things that he did among a very long list. And that actually is a perfect segue into your final question, which is, yes, Israel is now known as Startup Nation. And yes, people come from all over the world. I happen to be friends and neighbors with Saul Singer. I know Dan too well, but Saul just happens to live closer to me. Dan lives in New York. And there's a Startup Nation Central where smaller countries can learn how to get to scale up to what Israel does, where Israel is up there with the big boys. It's competing with the United States and West Germany and with Germany and the United Kingdom in terms of being number one in terms of investment and startup and innovation. But it's much bigger than the innovation story. The Zionist triumph should actually be a model to all smaller countries, to all countries that emerged after World War II, to have two things in mind. One, pride in your people, pride in your past. Vietnamese, Chinese, Indians, these are people who have built a modern country on an ancient civilization, just like Jews have. We should be able to have a special conversation about what it's like to live in what the great Zionist founder Theodor Herzl called Alt Neuland, Old New Land. What's it like to respect your traditions, respect your ancestors, respect your elders, but also think about tomorrow? So we start with a particular, and then we talk about the power of democracy. And Israel has shown that through a combination of democracy and capitalism and traditionalism and Judaism, you can create a very successful country. You can create a country that is not only creating a higher and higher level of lifestyle, a better and better lifestyle for its people, but is contributing more and more to the world. Israel today is a world leader in high tech, in pharma, in medical technology, in food tech, in climate issues, in fighting many of the scourges that we have. And so I'm very proud. I don't, as I've hopefully pointed out over the discussion, I don't pull back my criticism when there's something to criticize, but I also don't stop applauding and cheering and saluting when there's something to applaud and cheer and salute. And I'm so proud to be a part of this great adventure in Jewish history, this great adventure in human history called Zionism and called Israel and called the Jewish people. So thank you for your questions. Thank you for your careful reading of the book. And thank you for all that you're doing. And perhaps one of these days we'll meet either in Vienna or Vietnam, or come visit us in Jerusalem.
Of course. Yeah, I was going to say next year in Jerusalem, but I see that you're already there. But so thank you very much, Professor Giltroy, for this wonderful conversation about Israel, Zionism, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I wish you all the best, and
Thank you.
take care.
Take care.